You can start now, Jane.
Okay, sige. Good evening, good afternoon, or good morning to all participants to this webinar on Philippines as semi-colonial and semi-feudal society. I thank you all for having given your time to participate at this event. My broadcast location is Sydney, Australia. Therefore, I acknowledge the Aboriginal peoples of Australia and I pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. My name is Jane Brock of ILPS Australia, and I am your host at this event. The International League of People's Struggles has declared September 2020 to be a month of solidarity for the Philippines. The campaign will peak on the 21st of September at the marking of the declaration of martial law and will culminate in an online cultural program at the end of this month. The month of solidarity for the Philippines will also put a spotlight on the people's struggles in Asia Pacific, and it is a call out for solidarity to organizations worldwide. This solidarity event is a three-part series that will focus on Philippine society, the National Democratic Revolution, and the peace negotiations. Before we go further, I need to announce that Bahasa interpretation is available in the German channel. Please keep your microphone muted or closed throughout the webinar. All questions must be typed on the Q&A box, which you will find at the bottom of your Zoom frame. Our program flow will start with an opening message from Mr. Len Cooper, ILPS chairperson. But as of now, I think Len is still trying to get in or trying to log on. So I guess we'll get him to talk or to have his opening message at some point. And Mr. Sunny Africa, the Executive Director of Ibon Foundation, will be the first speaker, followed by Vince Simon, Secretary General, Anak Bayan, Philippines. Then we will have a brief intermission with a music video. Our last speaker is Lisa Ito, of Concerned Artists of the Philippines. Then after that, we will have the open forum with your questions, of course. Hopefully you will all be typing it up on the Q&A box. Then we will have the closing and some announcement. So I guess we'll have to move on to the first speaker because I can't see yet Len Cooper at this point. So we will have Sunny Africa. Oops, sorry. I'll just stop this, sorry. Because I was waiting for Len's call. Anyway, Sunny Africa, as I said, is the Executive Director of Ibon Foundation. He will discuss the major economic features of the Philippines as semi-colonial and semi-feudal society and how this is manifested in the current situation. So, Sunny, you have the podium.
Is that okay?
Yes.
Good morning, afternoon, evening to everyone. I will try to be brief because I've been warned I'm going to be wrung out if I go for too long. I'll share a screen na Jane, no? Is that okay? Yeah. Okay. Is that working?
It is working perfectly well.
Okay. So please start my 15 minutes when I click my first slide. Okay. In very brief. Sorry.
Yeah, someone are calling our phones. It's okay.
It might be Len. Okay.
Yes, it might be Len.
Okay. In a very brief presentation, I'll try to give an overview on the features of Philippine semi-feudalism today. It shouldn't take too long, so I hope not to have to be wrung out. Okay. Well, first thing is, of course, it's a big, a broad sweep of Philippine history, human history over the past um, century. The Philippine Republic is, it's over 120 years old. It's been nominally independent for over half that since 1946. And well, the last 70 years have seen, the rollback of colonialism, by virtue of some huge anti-imperialist, anti-colonial struggles, but also globalization, decades of globalization since the 1980s, and of course all these technological developments today. So after 120 years, it's actually always useful to ask. Is the Philippines still semi-feudal? Not just an academic question, but of course, it's a guidance over what our current struggles are going to be. So categorically, I think to establish the thesis of this presentation, yes, the Philippines is still semi-feudal. Of course, over 120 years, a lot of things have been changing, but I think the essential point of semi-feudalism still remains. And there's quite a lot of information data, but I won't go through all the details, but I'll flash some basic data, take out some highlights to establish our main thesis. Of course, the Philippines, I think, is not unique, but it's actually one of the biggest countries in the world. Whenever people speak of the Philippines, it's like we're a small country, but actually the Philippines is, depending on the year, either 12th or third largest country in the world by population. It's rich in natural resources, both mineral, agricultural, fishery, and forestry. And of course, that population is a huge stock of potentially productive labor with the right system in place. Now, where does the problem lie? It's not that the Philippines doesn't have the raw material for development. The reason is our economic system is not geared towards delivering development for the majority of Filipinos. So again, I'm not going to go to the particular details here, just to point out, when this presentation, I think when everyone speaks of semi-feudalism, it's really about a certain level of development at the simultaneously of the productive forces and the relations of production. I've picked out two main points I think are important. In terms of the productive forces, to be semi-feudal is to be mainly and essentially both agrarian and non-industrial. In terms of relations of production, who benefits from these operation of the productive forces, the homegrown comprador, big bourgeoisie, and landlord class in the service of foreign monopoly capitalism. So the people are there, but they're exploited for the benefit of the compradors, the landlords, and foreign monopoly capital. Now, I think this is the simplest way to be able to track developments in semi-feudalism as far back as Philippine economic data sets allow. All these worms, these lines, are the different economic sectors of the Philippine economy since 1946, the earliest date for which we have comparable data. So very important to highlight is the fat blue line on top. This is a combination of the production sectors of the economy, meaning manufacturing, agriculture, construction, also mining and quarrying. Very important point there is you see a basic stagnation of the productive sectors from the start of the post-war period until about the 1980s, and then quite dramatically a steep decline from the 1980s until today. The short explanation for that, which can be expanded, but which I won't, the short explanation is this period since the 1980s is the period of neoliberal imperialist globalization. So there was a lot of talk even early on that capitalist development, opening up global capitalist forces even more than before, would be the key to Philippine development. I think in very summary form, very succinctly, that has not happened. If anything, since the 1980s, where the end part of that line is, the cursor works, since the start of the 1980s until today, because of progressive implementation of these neoliberal globalization policies, I'm sure very familiar, trade and investment liberalization, privatization, and deregulation, instead of causing the Philippine economy to develop, it has caused its most important productive sectors to collapse to an unprecedented degree. Of course, in terms of implementation, the 1980s is quite important because that's also when the World Bank structural adjustment programs started being implemented in the Philippines. There's a little break in the data set because of a change in methodology, but you'll notice despite the change in methodology, the basic trend is unchanged. So very important point in terms of capturing the sense of a worsening semi-feudal economy is worsening agricultural backwardness and industrial decline. In the last maybe 5 to 10 years, that industrial decline, especially the Filipino manufacturing, has been covered up by a lot of foreign firms relocating to the Philippines from China and from elsewhere in the region. But again, despite foreign firms coming into the Philippines being reported by statistical data as part of Filipino manufacturing, you'll notice despite the bloating of the industrial sector by foreign manufacturers locating the Philippines, this gray line has still continued to decline, basically since the early 1970s, especially since the early 1980s. So I think that's one key point, one essential point about Philippine semi-feudalism, persisting agricultural backwardness, and actually, if anything, severe industrial decline during the period of imperialist globalization. Of course, that of course raises the question: if the production sectors are declining, where are people making their money and surviving from? Because our population wouldn't keep growing if people were not making money from anything. Well, the main replacement to the production sector has been services, but not just any kind of services, because there are some services that could be supporting agriculture and industrial development, but that is not the case in the Philippines. The main service in the Philippines, I think, can be broken down into more or less two types. The services supporting the comprador economy, meaning trade, transport, water and power, supporting the same kind of comprador enterprises that are facilitating resource extraction and cheap labor export in the Philippines, and also cheap labor services. Business process outsourcing call center, quite prominent since the 1990s. It's basically a cheap labor service being provided. So that's one big cluster of services. They're kind of capitalist, but they're very localized, very small as a sector. And the bigger actually part of services are consumption services, especially a lot of odd jobs and irregular work. Basically, anyone you see in the street selling something, or whether it's cigarettes or soft drinks, or with a small stall selling trinkets on the sidewalk, or carinderias, small sidewalk restaurants. That's the second major sector of services, a huge mass of odd jobs and irregular work, compensating for the lack of proper jobs in developed industry and agriculture. Also important feature of Philippine backwardness is how the Philippine economy is actually mainly an informal economy, both in terms of the size of its enterprises, but also in the character of those operations. They're very irregular work, low income work, low productivity work. In the Philippines right now, our last estimates, the formal sector out of a labor force, an unemployed labor force of about 45 million to 47 million, 31 million of that, that's three-fourths almost, are in the informal sector. Only 9 million in the formal sector, then about 2.8 million in government service. So again, that's another aspect. We're not only seeing this huge decline in production, but also a huge mass of informal work, which is very low productivity and very irregular in terms of the incomes they provide. Which raises the question, so where's the money coming from to support that kind of backward economy? If there's not enough work in manufacturing and agriculture, if a surplus isn't being generated and kept in the country because a lot of the manufacturing is foreign dominated, so where exactly is the money coming to support that service consumption-driven economy? Well, the bottom chart, the top chart is the earlier chart about the economic sectors. I forgot to highlight, of course, sorry. If the blue line is the production sector, the kind of gold yellow line is the service sector. And you will notice we reached a really major turning point in the late 1990s when the Philippines became a service economy more than a producing economy. So the question is, where is the money coming from to pay for all those services? Well, for the comprador kinds of services, especially the TNC operations in the Philippines, they pay for themselves. But I think as a consumption-driven economy, one major change in the Philippine economy is overseas work and remittances. The bottom chart is the absolute amount of overseas remittances. You'll notice by the middle of the 1990s, a huge increase in overseas remittances. So basically, what has been supporting the consumption-driven service economy in the Philippines, the single biggest, not the only factor, but the single biggest are overseas work and overseas remittances. And I think that's quite an important, relatively new feature of the Philippine semi-feudalism compared to the 50 or 60 years ago. This huge distortion of overseas work because these are Filipinos, brought up with the reproduction provided for by the Philippine economy. But when they're working, they're exploited abroad, usually by capitalists abroad, with all the benefits from all their work staying abroad. The only contribution to the local economy, which seems quite large, are that portion of their salaries that they send back as remittances. But again, in terms of the amount of economic surplus and production they create, the remittances, their salaries are a very small share of that. They're very, very heavily exploited, and the largest part of their production and their surplus actually goes to the foreign capitalists employing them. I know this is a very confusing chart, but we just want to highlight one important thing about our being a foreign-dominated economy. The little words you don't see, these are the different subsectors of the Philippine economy. There are three columns. The first column is agriculture. The second column is manufacturing. The last column is services. The red figures are the share of the economy. So right now, 9.2% of the economy is agriculture. Almost 19% is in manufacturing. A huge 61% in services. But I'd like to focus on manufacturing. But if someone wants the presentation, you can have a look at this. But if you look at manufacturing and look at the little, well, don't look at the little black and gray letters, but if you look at the subsectors represented, the blue numbers show how much of that subsector is basically held by foreign TNCs. You will notice a lot of them, we are reaching 90, 97 to 100% foreign ownership. So that just really highlights the very key aspect of industrial development, manufacturing, not the only part of industrial development, but one of the key sectors of industrial development and manufacturing. A large part of Philippine manufacturing is based in the Philippines, but actually foreign. So you'll notice a lot of sectors with 100%, 99% to 90% foreign domination of those sectors. So I think that's a quick summary of a quick snapshot of the Philippine foreign-dominated economy. The end result is that if you have economic backwardness, you won't be creating enough jobs for the people, for the Filipino population. So again, no coincidence. Relatively low unemployment before pre-1980s suddenly shot up after the 1980s, averaging over 10% over the last 4 decades. The last estimate, official estimate of the government is 2.6 million for 2019, but even the estimate is 4.7 because we're correcting for a change in definition in 2005. So the real unemployment level is about 9 to 10%, standing for the last 4 decades, but particularly reaching a magnitude of almost 5 million in 2019. But also highlighting, if you're looking at a 45 million labor force, 60 million doesn't sound, 5 million doesn't sound like a big share of distressed workers. But that's also because if you look at the informality of those working, a large part, by even estimate, 60-70% of those working are actually irregular workers in the informal sector with low earnings. So the joblessness is captured not just by the number of unemployed, but also by the quality of work of those unemployed, which is very low. This chart shows average annual employment generation for administration since in the post-Marcos period. So you'll notice a lot of bragging about very rapid economic growth since the Arroyo period. But you also notice how in the last 4 years of the Duterte administration, average job generation is even worse. It's the second worst in the post-Marcos period, and up to less than half even of previous administrations. So that's not an aberration. That is what a semi-feudal economy is. If you're relying on imports for your goods and services, if you don't have a substantial agricultural industrial base, You will have rapid growth because you're reflecting foreign investment and consumption, but you're not creating the jobs to support that production that they represent. So another good sign of semi-feudalism. In terms of because of the relations of production we have a comprador landlord class really dominating. Again, just to capture that sense, um, the Philippines has one of the most undemocratic economies on the planet. The richest 20 Filipinos own more wealth than the poorest 62 million. The richest 20 Filipinos last year had about 3.6 billion in wealth combined. That's almost $69 billion. That's as much wealth as is owned by the poorest 62 million of the population. Um, Again, this is might sound look confusing, but it's also quite straightforward. This just again distributes the columns into the major economic sectors: agriculture on the leftmost side, manufacturing, that grayish part, and then services on the right side. The rows are basically the country's biggest capitalists. You will notice the red bits are concentrated in the services side. It basically just says those in the blue rows, these are the Philippines' biggest capitalists. Where are they making their money from? Not from agriculture, not from manufacturing, which has very few red squares, but mainly from the service sector, which is basically reflecting how the biggest capitalists are supporting our comprador economy. I would also like to highlight, although for instance, the Ayalas seem to have there's a red cell there under auto manufacturing. That's not even manufacturing. The Ayalas are there. We only mark it as red because they're importing and assembling Honda cars from Japan. So even all those red squares under manufacturing, they don't really necessarily represent domestic industrial capitalist development. So to wrap up, I think Philippine semi-feudalism and non-industrial development has been affirmed by even the available data sets of the Philippine government. We can view them critically, but even at their best, they show definitely a backward economy. In terms of how we progress in terms of economic development in the post-war era, well, since the 1990s, we're even less of a producing economy today. We're more service-oriented and consumption-driven than ever before. We still have a very vast backward rural economy, which is also the reason why rural poverty remains very keen. We have the worst levels of poverty in the countryside. And yes, there are little tidbits, little pockets of shallow industrial development, but they're mainly in economic zones, and they're definitely all foreign dominated. They're here to take advantage of our cheap labor, our location in the region to sell their stuff to neighboring countries, and also to take advantage of any fiscal incentives that the government gives. The bottom line is, despite decades of seemingly, fast-paced developments in technology and globalization, an overhaul of the global economy, the Philippines is exactly, in essence, where it was as it was in the turn of the century. We are still seeing the old pattern of neocolonial trade. We export agriculture, mineral raw materials, and increasingly we're exporting cheap labor to pay for imported agricultural products and especially industrial goods and services. Our cheap labor, I think one modification from maybe 5, 6 decades ago, we're literally exporting cheap labor now. So the overseas worker phenomenon, maybe 10 to 12 million Filipinos overseas, that's, I think, the most brazen expression of cheap labor export we have. But in effect, if you look at the ecozone enclaves, not just in manufacturing, but even all the BPOs and call centers, that's in effect cheap labor export because they're really special economic zones. They have a time zone of their own. They're operating on, Western European or Northern American time zones. But that's also, I think, in effect, basically cheap labor export as well. And the bottom line, because of continued and actually worsening semi-feudalism in the Philippines and even greater industrial backwardness, right now, tens of millions of Filipinos are still poor and struggling, exploited, trying to eke out a living. As farmers, fisherfolk, odd jobbers, workers, and especially overseas Filipino workers. So I think that quick scan of Philippine economic history, especially recent economic history, really affirms our nationalist and democratic struggles right now remain more relevant than ever, especially looking towards, I think, one major insight that even the mainstream is acknowledging capitalism in the last decade, since the 2008-2009 financial crisis, has shown it is a dead end for development. So I think more than ever, it's affirmed our nationalist and democratic struggles should have that socialist perspective for the development of humanity in all the decades and centuries to come. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sunny. And indeed, it's a very comprehensive presentation, and I'm sure many of us would appreciate that, at last we have a better understanding of why human rights activists are being killed in the Philippines. Because the list that you have provided us would surely, the list of capitalists in the Philippines, we surely want to stay in that economic position forever. Now, let's move on to, the major political features of the Philippines as semi-colonial and semi-feudal society and how it is being manifested in the current situation. And that will be presented by Vince Simon, Secretary General of Anakbayan, Philippines.
Hello,
Vince.
everyone.
Yes.
Can we have the PowerPoint on screen?
I believe it is underway. Eman, are you there? Or Aaron?
Okay, give me 10 seconds.
Thank you. And much of our discussion regarding the political crisis in the Philippines is founded on the economic conditions of the country, which Kasani earlier had given a short piece. And the political crisis in the Philippines, of course, owes itself also to the class contradictions in the country. The Duterte regime is what we call it's not just a simple dictatorship or a tyranny. The Duterte regime is a bureaucrat capitalist regime that enables the export of the Philippines raw materials, its labor, and the export of much of our resources and semi-manufacture. So when we talk about the political crisis in the Philippines, we talk about class contradictions. So if we go for the next slide, thank you. Our discussion will first touch upon the structure of Duterte's tyranny. When we talk about the structure, we will consider the institutions that Duterte has embedded and in place in the Philippines to ensure that the semi-feudal standing of Philippine society remains in effect. And on the other hand, it's one of the things that the discussion will cover as well is the Duterte's war, effective war against the people. And before we move on to the assault on human rights, the persecution of the political opposition, and last but not the least, the prospects, or the what we could expect from this type of political crisis. So to begin, we could move on to the next slide. Thank you. So Duterte's structure for tyranny is founded on the military and the police. Duterte has invested a lot to ensure that the police and the military are well compensated to follow whatever Duterte and his generals order. So to ensure the steady support of Duterte's base in the police and the military, firstly, he doubled the wages of the military and the police rank and file, and the regime also ensured the provision of very generous benefits to the rank and file police and soldier. And for the more senior officials of the Duterte regime, for the more senior generals rather, Duterte opens up uh, senior government posts to retired generals from the military and the police. So as of uh, as of today, there's more than 60 um, retired generals assuming civilian posts, everything from social services, from interior and local government to the Philippine insurance system. A lot of um, a lot of posts inside the Philippine government are now headed by retired police or military generals. And one of the things also that Duterte has ensured to maintain the support of this of the military and the police is to sustain high levels of military expenditure. And the high levels of military expenditure has created this imbalance in the priorities of the government when it comes to addressing the present pandemic and the economic crisis. Um, for example, the incoming 2021 budget for the Philippines, um, the Duterte regime has placed emphasis, for example, on a local task force, on a national task force rather, which is primarily concerned with um, endangering and incriminating progressives and activists. So this particular this particular interagency task force, um, which we call the National Task Force to End Local Communist Armed Conflict, or the NTF-LCAC. This body has received a 2,000 more than 2,000% increase from its um, 2020 budget. So, and aside from that, the Duterte regime has also sustained projects such as the AFP modernization program to ensure that the military's coffers and its flagship projects are more or less ensured. And of course, Duterte has also been very vocal in absolving the police and the military from any form of accountability from their from whatever act, from the consequences of whatever action they commit. So in the course of almost more than 4 years of Duterte's presidency, a lot of the murders, a lot of the massacres, and a lot of the violations of human rights in the Philippines perpetrated by the police and the military have gone unpunished because Duterte has personally sworn to absolve and protect the military and the police from any form of accountability. And of course, the structure of Duterte's tyranny is directly manifested in the creation of a military junta that replaced the supposedly civilian bureaucracy. So this is what we have been discussing earlier, that a lot of cabinet positions and executive positions inside the government are headed by former generals from the police and the military. So if we move in, please, to the next slide. Thank you. One of the things also that Duterte ensures to institutionalize tyranny is to keep his benefactors, his partners, and enforcers uh, close. So one of the more recent examples is the chief of the Philippines health insurance corporation, the PhilHealth, and after after a national scandal involving 15 billion funds from the Philippines insurance program, uh, the chief of the Philippine health insurance program was replaced by a general from Duterte's past from as a mayor from Davao City, his home city. So, and then aside from that, no, the National Task Force, which we mentioned earlier, serves as Duterte's specialized body for the suppression of nationalist and democratic aspirations. This National Task Force to end local communist armed conflict is notorious in wasting public funds in order to vilify, in order to criminalize the activities and the advocacies of activists here in the Philippines. And it puts activists in a very dangerous position as the NTF, so to speak, seeks to remove the line between the armed struggle waged by the Communist Party of the Philippines and the NPA and the activists, Filipino activists in the country. And much of the, the playbook that guides the Duterte regime is actually instructed by the United States Counterinsurgency Guide and the other similar references. And in particular, the Duterte regime has enacted this so-called whole of nation approach, this whole of government approach, which basically weaponizes the entire Philippine government and directs it at its counterinsurgency objectives. And the trouble with directing the entire government towards counterinsurgency is that it purposely forgets, and it purposely sidelines the social basis for the ongoing civil war in the Philippines. It purposely neglects to address the long-standing social issues and the long-standing economic problems in the country that has repeatedly created various movements in the country. And this whole of nation approach is especially dangerous because it spends public funds to basically go after activists, to criminalize them, to make them targets of military operations. So this is the structure of Duterte's tyranny. He ensured the police and military by doubling their pay, by promising them attractive retirement plans as senior executives and senior managers in the inside the government. And it has created this national task force to basically oversee that the whole government of the Philippines is single-mindedly pursuing the destruction, basically, of the people's resistance in the country. So we move on to the next slide, please. So Duterte's machinery and structure for tyranny is, of course, directed at the toiling masses. It's very easy to say that activists from all parts of the Philippines are targeted, and it's because it is true. However, the largest casualties and many of Duterte's victims are actually the ordinary Filipino working class, the ordinary Filipino peasant, because Duterte's war against the Filipino people, although it is primarily pursued through anti-people policies is also um, expressed through outright violence. So if we go through this list of anti-people policies, we also revisit some of Mr. Sani Africa's discussion earlier. But in essence, a lot of Duterte's policies are anti-poor, pro-big business, and in essence, neoliberal. So it upholds the semi-colonial and the semi-feudal standing of the Philippines by ensuring that the peasants remain landless, and the wages are stagnant, that labor injustice persists, and unions are weak, among other things. And of course, directly, Duterte has assailed the Filipino people through its drug war. So estimates now run up to 30,000 victims of Duterte's drug war in the country. And these include a lot of these victims from Duterte's drug war are ordinary Filipino folk from urban poor communities. And to make matters worse, during this lockdown, Duterte has saw fit to enforce a militaristic lockdown, not to address the pandemic, but in order to restrict the movement of the people and put them under the thumb of the police and the military. And if we follow the news on the Philippines today, we know that the lockdown, which was supposed to address the pandemic, has failed miserably, and we are still in the middle of the first wave of the pandemic. And as we have earlier discussed, the war against the toiling masses that Duterte prosecutes also includes the detention, the intimidation, and the assassination of everyone who so much so speaks up against Duterte. So peasant leaders such as Randy Chanings, unionists, and human rights defenders such as Zara Alvarez have all become victims of Duterte's war against the toiling masses. Next slide, please. And of course, this war against the toiling masses also tramples upon the human rights that the Filipinos should enjoy. And one of the main ways that Duterte assails human rights in the country is the denial of proper provision of services. So Duterte has increasingly privatized, increasingly commercialized a lot of services, ranging from utilities to transportation, which makes it more expensive and inaccessible for everyday Filipino folk to avail these services and realize their rights. And of course, the restrictions of the lockdown during the pandemic has also curtailed the rights of millions of Filipinos to employment and livelihood. We are now in the middle of a historic jobs crisis, which even the Marcos years failed to compare to. And even, of course, during the lockdown, Filipinos have been subject to the worst forms of treatment. We have documented cases of people being put in cages, of people being put in coffins as a way of punishment, of people being made to dance, made to kiss each other, all sorts of unfair and inhumane treatment. We have numerous thousands of cases of such inhumane and unfair quarantine lockdown punishments. And of course, the assault on human rights has also stepped over the free press in the country. And one of the more overt examples of how the free press was attacked was the denial of ABS-CBN's franchise. ABS-CBN is one of the largest media outlets in the country, and Duterte ensured to take ABS-CBN down for a various set of petty and insidious reasons, you know. And of course, there's the cyber libel case versus the CEO of Rappler, Maria Ressa, which all points to the desire of Duterte to constrict, the democratic space in the Philippines and to control the narratives that the media produces. And then finally, there are various attacks on civil and political rights in the country, including censorship of social media, the breakup and restrictions of mobilization. And in the middle of the pandemic, all of these attacks on the civil and political rights of the Filipinos have become all the more obvious. So we have also documented cases of a lot of ordinary social media commenters, of a lot of Facebook users, Twitter users, being served subpoenas from the Philippines National Bureau of Investigation, regarding regarding the content they interact with or create in social media. And there are a lot of mobilizations, protests in the Philippines, which ended up with organizers, with protesters being incarcerated. So from students, from public transport drivers, to peasants, a lot of sectors and a lot of organizations in the country have experienced the breakup or restrictions of mobilizations, especially during this militaristic lockdown that the Philippines is under. And if we move on to the next slide, there is also the persecution of the political opposition. So there is an antagonism between Duterte and the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church has, in the Philippines at least, has long stood against the extrajudicial killings of Duterte's drug war, and Duterte has been very vocal of his opposition to his critics from the Catholic Church. And there is also the contradiction between the political opposition and Duterte. So there are a fair number of senators. There's a fair number of representatives in the Philippines Congress that are vocal against the regime and are very critical of Duterte. And Duterte's persecution of the political opposition is also manifested in the continued detention of political prisoners. So there are hundreds of political prisoners in the Philippines. Many of them are incarcerated because of false or trumped-up charges, and they suffer the worst conditions in the Philippines' very cramped prison, exposed to the virus, exposed to very inhumane conditions inside Philippine prisons. But Duterte and his government continues to deny these political prisoners liberty, especially during this, in the middle of this pandemic. And of course, the Duterte regime is also very active in a disinformation campaign against progressives and the opposition. So they generally employ strategic communications tactics to gaslight, to whitewash, or to deliver half-truths, and to outright lie to the Filipino people regarding the status of the Philippines, on the nature of the people's resistance. And this is all part of the persecution of the political opposition. And Duterte is noted for keeping an online troll army in order to wage this disinformation campaign against progressives and against the opposition. So next slide, please. So the Philippines is, and the crisis, the political crisis in the Philippines, I believe is yet to reach this watershed moment. But the conditions are there. Um, every day, the crisis, economically, politically, culturally, it unfolds, and it exposes Duterte as as the traitor to the Filipino people, as the killer of the Filipino people, and the resistance to Duterte is also growing. Ever since the lockdown, people's organizations from all across the Philippines have noted a spike in their membership. Chapters of people's organizations are being established nationwide at different cities, at different provinces of the Philippines, and a lot more people are expressing their dissatisfaction in one way or another at Duterte. But the people's the growth of the people's resistance against Duterte's regime all the makes it more necessary for Duterte to enact harsher and harsher policies, and which creates this conditions for a storm uh, in Philippine society, where Duterte, on one hand, continues to kill, continues to oppress and exploit the Filipino people, and the Filipino people, on the other hand, standing up and saying the oppression and the exploitation is enough. But Duterte will not give up power easily, and it will be up to the Filipino.
Hmm. I think we've lost Vince. So his video has stalled. Hello, Vince. How are you going? Okay, so I guess. Hello, Vince. Yeah, it must be the internet in the Philippines. So where is Lisa? I guess we have to move on. Yes. What do you think? It seems like, yeah, Vince says you have to unmute yourself, Lisa.
Sorry.
Yeah, we have lost Vince. Okay, Vince, do you
Hello.
want to just close it?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Fine. The stage is set for greater struggles and greater victories for the Filipino people. The Filipino people will not give up, um, and they will definitely and we are definitely up to the task of replacing this regime and staying the course towards national democracy and eventually towards socialism. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Vince. And you've given us a lot of hope with a young person like you, uh, giving us all of these, scenarios of what is happening and what could possibly be the build-up of a storm against Duterte. And so now let's have Lisa Ito, who will discuss the major cultural features of the Philippines as semi-colonial and semi-feudal society and how it is expressed in the current situation. Lisa is an independent curator, cultural worker, and writer based in Manila. She is the current Secretary General of the Concerned Artists of the Philippines, an organization of progressive artists, and a member of the Young Critics Circle Film Desk. She is also a faculty member of the University of the Philippines of Fine Arts in Diliman, Quezon City. So, yes, have the podium, Lisa. You are, you have to unmute you. Okay. Thank you.
Sorry. Thank you. Thank you, Ka Jane. Will I be sharing screen or iba po?
I
Do,
believe
yeah, you can. Do you want to share your screen? You can if you want to.
I can. Okay.
Yes.
Thank you. Hello, good evening, everyone. Uh, wait. Um, is this okay?
Maybe you can have it. Yes, as a
This
PowerPoint.
one?
Yep.
Okay. Hello, good evening. Magandang hapon to everyone. I'm from CAP, as Jane mentioned, an organization of Filipino artists, and we were founded back during the days of struggle against the dictatorship, and it's something that we're commemorating this month here in the Philippines. Now, my presentation is titled "Puppet Regimes." I'll explain later. First, I wanted to say to introduce also the organization, Concerned Artists of the Philippines. We were founded during those days during the people's struggle against tyranny, around the principles of freedom, justice, democracy in Philippine society. Um, our founding members uh, united on the belief that artists are citizens. We must concern ourselves with not only our art, but also with issues and problems confronting society. Um, we we stand for freedom of expression and oppose all the acts that tend to abridge or suppress that freedom. It should be protected. We believe that artists have a responsibility to uphold truth and justice, and of course, the interests of the Filipino people. And lastly, CAP believes that a genuine national culture, which is responsive to the needs and realities of the Filipino people, should be struggled for. When CAP was set up, it was the time of struggle against the puppet regime. But eventually, we embraced the larger anti-imperialist struggle in looking at the causes of Philippine society's problems. And today, we are a member of the ILPS Commission 14 on arts, culture, and the free flow of information. Now, we've been asked to reflect on semi-feudalism and semi-colonialism and how it relates to Philippine culture and art, as well as the people's struggle. Kasani and Gavin's earlier discussed how semi-feudalism and semi-colonialism are manifest across the fields of our economy and our politics. And I wanted to show you this artwork, which also illustrates and is related to these points. Now, this what you see here is part of an artwork, an installation at the University Library titled Third from the World. It was made by Rensley, uh, who was a who was a progressive young artist who devoted his life to serving the Filipino peasants. Unfortunately, Renz passed away a year ago at a very young age. Now, one of the more memorable works of Renz was this installation made from writing on the walls with chalk. Uh, and he looked at he wrote down many texts, diagrams, pasted images of histories of Southeast Asian dictatorships and what they had in common. He included information and quotations on Marxism also, as you can see. Now, we have a common history of colonialism. We have a common history of local dictatorships and the experience with neocolonialism. Uh, we share that with other Southeast Asian countries, but we also share a rich history of people's movements um, against against authoritarian rule. And culture is also part of that story. And whatever our experience of these dictatorships are, it's important to remember that not are all of these stories happening alongside each other are not coincidental, but very structural. The dominant forces in our economy, in our politics, are made possible by state structures, which are in this quote in one photo, organizations of violence for the oppression of classes. Now, the relationship is also true for the culture and arts. Any inequalities that we see in the mode of production in society are also reflected in the relations of production, which also encompasses our cultural and social life. Therefore, any history of culture and the arts in society, it's also a history of class struggle and the relationship between society's 1% and the 99%. of course, it's a complicated relationship. Now, whenever we refer to culture, we are talking about a broader phenomenon, and not just culture as a sphere which is exclusive to only a few who have been able to study or to access this. We refer to culture as something referring to includes all beliefs, customs, all social behavior, um, any prevailing attitudes and ways of life of a society at a given time or across time. It includes how we think, how we process our ways of thinking about how the economy, how politics should go, our laws, moral codes, and our creative works and art. Culture, it's accumulated across generations. Yeah. And it can represent traditions, or dominant traditions, or emerging or new forces in our society and economy. Therefore, class relationships are also reflected and struggled out in the realm of culture. Now, art, the field of arts and the different arts that we see, from music to the visual arts and everything, these are all reflections of society and its contradictions as well. Art is part of our cultural life, and it uses our skill, our imagination, and our resources and materials on hand to transform our aspirations and experiences into things or moments that help us express and understand the world, like what Renz has done. Art can serve class interests, true, but it can also reflect social truth. Therefore, art and culture is important, very crucial in any movement for social, political, and economic justice. Now, if we look at the history of Philippine society, we see that our culture is very much influenced and dominated by the experience of colonialism and the ongoing struggle against semi-colonial and semi-feudal order. The semi-colonial and semi-feudal order that our resource speakers have talked about. Um, if we look at if we go to the history of the Philippines all the way from the pre-Hispanic times, before European conquest and colonization in the mid 16th century, uh, we will see that we've been through several waves of colonial rule, first by the Spanish, then by the United States, then Japan, then reverting back to the US until the supposed period of independence, which, as we know it, is fake. A fake type of independence and an illusory form of independence, um, where foreign and local feudal interests remain dominant. Uh, and the period of martial law, the period of dictatorships, which all our countries went through in Southeast Asia, that also belongs to that period of time of neo-colonialism. Um, if we look at uh, what we have, the 7,000 islands, a nation which is archipelagic, which is agricultural, which is connected, uh, and which connects us by the sea, it's very important to note how our country is so rich in natural resources. Our strategic location, our national patrimony has made us all targets as well of colonial powers who coveted and invaded um, our territories precisely for the purpose of economic extraction and profit. This process of colonization, of course, it changed and shaped Philippine culture. And this slide shows a lot of uh, artifacts and artworks dating back from the pre-Hispanic era. I don't talk about these individually, but um, uh, what it shows us is how the kind of Philippines that colonial rule uh, uh, wanted to conquer. In pre-colonial or pre-Hispanic Philippines, of course, it's not true that we did not have any level of quote-unquote civilization. Uh, there were many small, autonomous, predominantly Malay societies influenced by other societies in Southeast Asia and China, which were already present and in different states of socio-political development. The highest of these being the Islamic sultanates in the south, um, by the time of the 16th century. Now, this shared past, it connects us culturally to the rest of Asia and the Pacific. Uh, you can see many common motifs, especially in traditional art. Now, the bars above, it shows many art forms which also reflect the rich natural wealth that we have. Earth, gold, minerals, forest, and textile products, all of these indicating how rich our biodiversity was and is. Um, it reflects the connections between our ecology and our cultural life. Ironically, a lot of these resources are the same resources which are lost to the extraction of our ecology, of our national patrimony, due to colonial and imperialist plunder. Uh, you just look at the national bird now, the Philippine eagle. It's a critically endangered species. The national tree, the Nara, it's also vulnerable, and both have been endangered because of human activities related to profit-driven extraction over the decades, especially during the colonial eras and the 1970s. Um, Now, much of what survives from our older traditional cultures is not just there because of adaptation, but because of the resistance of indigenous peoples to colonialism, particularly in the Cordillera in the north and among the Moro and Lumad peoples in the south. So therefore, defending one's territory and ancestral land is important to preserving our culture and our way of life. Now, the next slide is a very, very, very short, condensed summary of of the next 400 years in our history, which was 400 years of colonialism, which shaped Philippine cultural life, but also 400 years of people's resistance. Culture and the arts was a huge part of the process of colonization and resistance um, across the Spanish, US, and the Japanese periods. Um, so this is a summary of, so of course, under Spain, um, the cross and the sword, quote unquote, was integral to colonizing the Philippines. It was not just military rule, but religious conversion of the populace, which also completed that process for the Spanish under the U.S. Colonial government. It was a military government, but also it used the power and influence of education, knowledge production, mass media, art forms to also indoctrinate a new generation of Filipinos who would continue on and accept the colonial order. This was also the same experience during the Japanese occupation. So we have this. I don't go into the particular details and art forms here, but it's important to see in this second column how different aspects of culture were consciously developed and propagated by various colonial regimes in order to completely subjugate the country. But if we look at the third column, we can also see that we have a rich history of revolt. The sum effect of um, uh, culture and colonialism was to produce a population that was passive, that accepted the order and exploitation that went along with it. Um, but at the same time, we know that our country, the Philippines, has a rich tradition of people's resistance. We fought from the very start, and these narratives of resistance and revolts and fighting back are something that we should culturally also try to hold on to. Um, from the sporadic and uh, separate revolts um, against the Spanish, to the movement for secularization, to the movement for nationalism, to the first propaganda movement of the Ilustrados. Um, we ended uh, uh, victorious over Spain in an armed revolution. But of course, this was quickly subjugated under American colonial rule. But even then, uh, a movement for nationalism, Filipinization, for national liberation, and the birth of the workers and peasant movements happened during the American colonial period. Uh, And of course, during the Japanese period was the anti-fascist struggle for liberation from Japan. And all across this timeline, you have the history of armed revolution of Filipinos um, fighting for the country and its liberation from colonial rule. And culture was a part of that whole process uh, as well. If we go to the 74 years of supposed independence when the Philippines transitioned into the neo-colonial order, where we were independent in name but economically or politically always subjugated by foreign powers, especially the U.S. Uh, we can also see that culture was part of this process. Anti-communism, Cold War propaganda, education, mass media, popular culture was a defining feature of the 1950s to the 1960s. Um, all the way up to and many facets related to this can be seen up to the present time, but still this history of people's resistance continues. uh, Nationalism, and that was manifest all the way from the the movement for national language to yung interest in Philippine archaeology, Philippine art, national identity in art. All of these were manifest also during this time. The anti-imperialist struggle grew, the second propaganda movement. Uh, we have this whole history of resistance against the neo-colonial order and the dictatorships that followed. Um, and this period gave birth to cultural movements, organizations which exist up to now, as well as the call for a nationalist, scientific, and mass-oriented culture. So the sum total of this history of semi-feudalism and semi-colonialism, it has contributed through the years and through the decades to a dominant culture which is largely critiqued as colonial, as bourgeois, as feudal. It's a culture that serves the interests of the 1%. Now, this kind of crisis in culture, traditionally, it has served the interests of that class. No? It bred dependency, it normalized imperialist intervention and dominance, and maintained the relationship between the oppressor and the oppressed. Today, it has been worsened by the impacts of globalization, neoliberalism, the war on terror, and impunity um, versus the 99%. Um, but at the same time, you also have many instances where we can see culture and art fighting back, um, um, assimilating elements from cultures that were introduced, but at the same time also reflecting part of society. One example I have of this is the art form of effigies, which you often see in rallies. Here in Manila, especially before the pre-pandemic period. Now, effigies, if we look at its history, it's also related to art forms which emerged during the Spanish colonial period, which were also brought to us or which we were exposed to during the Vietnam War when we saw uh, demonstrations abroad, and which were used as agitational propaganda by mass organizations since the 1960s. Of course, during the period of martial law, they disappeared, but they resurfaced during the time of resistance since the 1980s. But a lot of the effigies were art forms which reflected protest in society. And part of the symbolism that we see here often is the symbolism of not just the president himself or herself alone, but always in tandem with Uncle Sam or whoever represents the American president at that time. So that um, as a protest art form, effigies also um, uh, were effective means of conveying to the people this analysis of how um, the different presidents of the neo-colonial order uh, uh, were all similar in essence. They may be different in name, but all were similarly beholden or controlled um, by foreign powers. No? And that's true for the different effigies that we see across time. Um, Now, going back to the point how semi-feudalism and semi-colonialism have contributed to a dominant culture which serves the interests of 1%. Um, One example I also wanted to relate was the impacts of mining, large-scale transnational mining on the country. We know it has caused a lot of damage. The mining neoliberalization policy, um, since the law was passed in 1995 and reinforced and implemented. At the same time, it's also reflected in the cultural sphere through corporate social responsibility projects, which also attempt to normalize um, the the presence of foreign corporate mining operations in the country. So that's just one specific example of how uh, 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 um, such control is very blatantly manifest. Um, all in all, the different interests kept in place by semi-feudalism and semi-colonialism. Um, these have also contributed to the current state of force that we see and the current attacks that we experience. Vince has talked about how the regime politically uses force, tyranny, authoritarian rule to quell people's resistance. And the artist sector has also felt its share of such attacks. We've seen how the human rights situation has worsened over the past 5 years, how even artists and cultural workers have not been spared from red tagging, from arrests, from trumped up charges, and even from killings. Now, most of those who are being killed among cultural workers are those who are serving the grassroots, yung farmers, yung workers, the peasant poor, the urban poor who are the most displaced under the current order. Um, but again, we this history of resistance that we have continues, uh, and the call for a national list for a scientific and mass-oriented culture uh, remains alive in the practice of the youth, of cultural workers, and grassroots and people's organizations on the ground. Uh, there's a need to continue developing a national culture which puts us, the country's interests above all foremost, um, above imperialist interests. There's a need for a scientific outlook to culture, which aims for progress, which aims for um, uh, uh, development that is truly for the people, uh, and a mass-oriented culture which is immersed and which is based in the people's struggles. Um, the history of our country teaches us that art and cultural work, it's part of the people's struggle against imperialism, against feudalism and bureaucrat capitalism. And we have that rich history to learn from, to remember, and to continue with. Uh, I end with this slide, um, sharing how um, artists have continued to also depict the people's struggles through different art forms. The history of semi-feudalism, it has created so many haciendas, plantations all over the country. Sometimes these appear in the works of of artists. In the mid 1970s, the director Ben Cervantes produced this documentary titled Sakada, and it was about the sugarcane workers in Negros Island. Um, who until now are among the poorest in the country. Their conditions have not yet changed. Uh, Negros until now remains a land of sugar workers who are most oppressed and who are killed by the regime. But during this time, during the middle of martial law, people like artists dared to make works, films that spoke about their conditions. For this, they were jailed and detained. Um, but the tradition of reflecting the struggles of the peoples of the peasants is still alive up to now. The other photos show footage from a massacre which happened in 1985 in Escalante, also in Negros. the Escalante massacre, which happened during during the years leading to the dictatorship's downfall. As a matter of commemoration, the town would every year since 1985 um, hold a reenactment of that massacre, always with the objective of remembering what happened and protesting against the lack of justice over the killings back then and the lack of social justice in Negros up to the present. Um, and this is a form of culture fighting back. We have a lot to learn from our history of cultural resistance against colonialism and neocolonialism, and um, and uh, but it's something that we should be proud of as a people's movement and as Filipinos who have um, struggled through time. Yeah. So that's where I end my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lisa. And really, it's very important to have our cultural work be part of our whole organizing and doing education work with the masses. And clearly, your presentation have shown that. So now we have to move quickly to the open forum. And now we have three questions. And I believe the first question is for Sunny Africa. It says there are some views that the peasants' main problem is productivity and not land. They use old farm implements like hand tools rather than mechanized farm implements, making their output low but costly, and therefore loses in the market. They continue to assert that even if given the land, but with a low productivity, the peasants will remain poor. Your thoughts on this?
Uh, well, of course, productivity is a problem, but the bigger problem is even if you improve productivity, who will benefit from the increased production? And if the peasants are always going to be at a disadvantage, not owning their land, being at a disadvantage when dealing with traders or other local capitalists, especially with the landlords, whatever increased productivity they get won't be going to them. So ultimately, the most important means of production remains land in the countryside. If you control your land, then you work on improving your productivity, because once you have the land, you have a better chance of making sure that any economic surplus goes to you rather than the landlords or the traders or money lenders or even the government.
Thank you, Sunny. Then the next question is for Vince. How is COVID-19 affecting the people's movement's ability to mobilize and organize against the Duterte regime? And what ways are being used to try to overcome these problems?
The pandemic has affected mobility.
Yes, Vince. We cannot hear you
There, hello?
suddenly. Okay.
Hello. Is this
So, okay.
hello?
Yes. Yes, we can hear you.
Apologies. Definitely, the pandemic has affected the mobility of the people and organizers as well. Um, there are a lot of communities that experience sporadic lockdowns, which span from a week to a couple of weeks to months, and these lockdowns affect organizing work because organizers can't get into communities, can't get into the people when these communities are locked down. There are also at the present, the lockdown in the Philippines has been more lenient. But previously, during the more stricter periods of quarantine in the country, um, We have been subjected to checkpoints. We have been subjected to searches, but we have devised ways and strategies and approaches in dealing firstly with the pandemic, and secondly with the more visible and more numerous police and military presence in the country. So in dealing with with COVID-19, of course, we have released and we continue to observe health protocols in our offices, and as we do our organizing work in the communities, we disinfect regularly. We do all the minimum health standards, and on the other hand, we are keener and more cautious at the moment in our organizing and in our political work. We are more conscious of the movements of the police. We're more conscious about our security, and we accordingly prepare ourselves depending on the security situation of the community we are organizing.
Thank you. So the third question is, under the new forms of colonialism, the imperial power uses local puppets. Well, Lisa, you've shown us several puppets, but surely this is the real one to ensure their interest is maintained. Do you think this is more risky for the imperialists, since these are local puppets and they can turn their backs on their former masters and uphold the interests of their nation rather than of the imperial master? Interesting question.
Do that, but there are higher to the imperialists, that kind of process. It's more deceptive and more advantageous to them if they have a puppet in place instead of them living directly in the old way. In the history of nations, there were successive revolutions against direct colonial rule. All of these were successful um, in overcoming direct colonialism. So neocolonialism was the adjustment to that. Uh, Now, the neo-colonial order, if anything goes wrong there with their puppet, they always have the puppet regime.
Oh, we cannot hear you. I guess you have to move closer to the mic. Because there's another question for you, Lisa. Maybe I should read it now. You can include. Okay. How is the Duterte regime using culture now to continue his rule?
Okay po. The first question before that about the puppet
Mhm.
regime,
Yes.
yes, it's more advantageous for the colonial or imperialist powers to have puppet regimes in place because there are higher risks, but also higher gains for them to be continuing their rule and deceiving the people. Because if anything goes wrong, um, they have the puppet regime to blame or to clean up or to be held responsible to. And if the puppet regime is really corrupt, that draws attention away from the structural inequality of of imperialism and neoliberalism. That's why I think the artists here, they never forget to always include some reference to U.S. imperialism in their works, even if it's about if it depicts the president as a figure, because it never forgets that the president is acting on behalf of larger interests at stake. Then for the Duterte regime, how it uses culture to continue its rule, uh, it it uses culture very effectively for one, no, and it knows the power of culture. I think in winning the minds of the people. The very fact that there's a troll army, which is not only paid, but some of which uh, consciously still carry that line, means that there is some cultural offense at work. No, it's not just economics, but also it's able to access a part of the population um, um, which continues to echo the line of the regime. Second, it is also consciously patronizing culture. at least certain segments of that. For instance, it wages a propaganda war. It by giving funding for not just military but also for the cultural products of the military to be spreading black propaganda against organizations. So there is that deployment and funding of culture for counterinsurgency, and that's one very clear example of how culture is being funded by the regime in order to actively red tag and harass activists. Um, the degree of cultural support that it gives for counterinsurgency, it's very stark in contrast to the lack of cultural support for the country's artists and cultural workers who are mostly um, freelance workers in the informal economy. There's very weak public support for the arts. You don't find artists who are really employed by the government or receiving a lot of funding from the government. A lot of artists are largely dependent on private patronage, private patrons to buy their art or to support it. And usually these patrons come from the 1% of society, including big landlords and comprador classes who have more global mobility and access to that. So it maintains that kind of state neglect for the arts while at the same time uh, channeling certain segments of the arts which are used for propaganda against the people's movement.
Thank you, Lisa. And I guess that really gives us the big challenge of, smashing, I would say, to smash the ideological apparatus of the ruling class. So I guess that's where our open forum ends. And we have with us, I can see him on the screen, Len Cooper, the ILPS chairperson, who will give us the combined opening message, opening for the whole campaign, as well as the closing for this webinar, this first webinar. Please, be on the podium, our virtual podium, Len, and you can unmute yourself.
Yes, thank you very much, Jane. I'd like to thank the speakers for their contributions tonight. They were very inspiring and very informative. It's good. And I wanted to just have a very short statement to say that we're going to meet throughout September to express the utmost solidarity with the Filipino people. The Filipino people have been and are in the forefront of the global struggle against fascism and for the democratic and human rights of the people. The Duterte regime, in its terrorising of the Filipino people, hopes that the threats and violence and anti-democratic laws and militarisation of the state will intimidate the people into silence and submission. Now, what a foolish president Duterte is to believe that. The Filipino people not only will not be intimidated, they will step up their important struggles for the freedom and liberation of the people. They will be successful as they were in defeating Marcos, the last Filipino dictator. The mass movement of the people in the Philippines grows stronger and more effective, and this will guarantee the tyrant and the fool Duterte will be swept away by the people. Duterte's fascism and the US imperialist support for it is not a sign of their strength, but a sign of their desperate weakness and panic over the loss of their corrupt earnings and their privileges due to the mass movement of the Filipino people and their support from the people of the world. We're delighted and determined to be in solidarity with the magnificent struggle of the Filipino people. We salute you. Long live the struggle for freedom and democracy. and long live the global solidarity with the Filipino liberation movement. Congratulations on your success so far and the successes yet to come. Thank you.
Thank you, Len. And indeed, it's so inspirational for our comrades, especially in the Philippines and worldwide, to have solidarity activists in various countries, especially in the Asia Pacific, in supporting the struggle of the Filipino people for national liberation. And on that note, I'd like to thank all of the participants at this webinar. I also thank all of our speakers, of course, Len Cooper, Sunny Africa, Vince Simon, and Lisa Ito. And we say thank you also to Aaron of the ILPS Asia Pacific, who have helped us all throughout the webinar. And before we close, finally, I need to announce that the second webinar will be on Friday, September 11 at 6 p.m. Philippine time. The topic will be on the importance of the National Democratic Revolution in the Philippines and its programs. The speakers are Professor Jose Maria Sison, who will discuss the importance of the National Democratic Revolution of the Philippines and the international anti-imperialist movement. And the other speaker is Renato Reyes Jr. of Bayan, the National Patriotic Alliance in the Philippines, who will discuss the program of the National Democratic Struggle. Then the third webinar will be held on the 18th of September. And the topic is peace negotiations and the lessons that we gathered from all of these peace negotiations. And of course, it is within the context of the People's War in the Philippines. It will be also at 6 p.m. Philippine time. And our speaker is Julie De Lima, the interim chairperson of the National Democratic Front of the Philippines Peace Negotiation Panel. So we're hoping that we can still answer questions. And in fact, there is one question for you, Sunny, but perhaps you can type up the question later. I mean, the answer to the question, because I guess people are falling out, and especially for those in Australia and in New Zealand. It's almost midnight. So I think, yes, we will have to end with a note that mabuhay ang bayan, ang makabayang Pilipino, mabuhay ang Rebolusyong Pilipino, mabuhay tayong lahat. Thank you.